I think we're looking so we're not far around. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Natalie Carvalho here to give us a talk, and I think she will tell more details about what to talk about. But I want to tell you a few words about her. She's a senior research fellow at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Dr. Natalie Carvalho holds joint appointment with the Global Burden of Disease Group on the Health Economics Unit at the Center for Health Policy. And she's a current recipient of the University of Melbourne Mackenzie Fellowship, from my understanding. So this is fellowship to attract talented new graduates who are able to work cross-disciplinary, have like some cross-disciplinary work, so she can lead these types of work, I think. And my understanding is that you are interested in thinking of budgetary equity when thinking of cost-effectiveness analysis in maternal and child health in low and middle income countries. Right? Yeah. Okay. So I think you'll tell more then. So please welcome.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so most of my work actually focuses predominantly on straightforward cost-effectiveness analyses and some methodological advances to suggest around cost-effectiveness analysis, primarily looking at maternal and child health and vaccines specifically over the last few years. What I'm presenting here is a little bit of a side project that I've been working on and some background around that. So this really has to do with methods around valuing health space. QALYs and DALYs, looking at the distinctions between the two, and talking about some new work that we're doing at the moment to look at some of the distinctions between those two. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. And so the title of my talk today, oh, by the way, feel free, I'll leave some time at the end for some questions so we can have a bit of a discussion, but feel free, if I say anything that is unclear or that you just have a clarification question, feel free to interrupt me at any time. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm happy to stop. So my title for my talk today is Methods for Measuring and Valuing Health Gains for Cost Utility Analysis. I'm going to talk about current approaches that are being used in current methods, and then some new insights into framing effects. And I'll clarify what I mean by framing effects as we go on. So there's two parts to the talk today. The first part is really a background to lay out the framework on how QALYs and DALYs are used, what they are, the distinctions between utility weights and visibility weights, and I'll talk about the different methods that are being used at the moment for valuing elicited valuations for health states. The second part, the second half of this talk, will focus on some current work that is ongoing at the moment that I'm working on, that looks at really trying to distinguish health, the framing effects of health versus health-related quality of life when you're looking at valuing different health states, health status. And so I'll talk about the methods that we've used, some preliminary results, still work in progress, and some of the important policy implications and further directions that we want to go in for this work. So to start with a bit of background on the difference between QALYs and DALYs and how they're used, I think we all know that they're both used for priority setting through cost utility analysis. So the two main measures, composite measures of health that are generally used in dollars per QALY or dollars per DALY studies. And there's a wealth of literature that has looked at the difference between QALYs and DALYs, most of which I'll be touching on in today's talk. Some of the earlier work focused a lot, because there's a lot of tension around the issue of age weighting with DALYs. And so if you're not sure what age weighting was, it was this function that you can see here in this chart that was used to place a societal value on different ages of life. Where middle-aged were weighted a little bit more than the very young and the very old. This is not something I'm going to be talking much about in today's talk, because the most recent global burden of disease studies have taken away this age weighting factor. And so I'm going to be focusing on some of the other distinctions that exist between QALYs and DALYs. So as you probably know, QALYs are obtained through the use of health utility weights, DALYs through the use of disability weights. And we often think of health utilities and disability weights as sort of converse and interchangeable. So we think about the fact that we can, if we don't have a utility weight for something, potentially we could use 1 minus visibility weight and vice versa. So I'll be focusing on this for the bulk of this talk. And just to start with a bit of a refresher, just in case, for those of you who don't work in this space and who aren't that familiar with QALYs and DALYs, just a brief overview of what QALYs and what DALYs are. You might imagine this sort of health profile that you can see here on this chart. So on your x-axis, you have time, length of life, how long someone lives. On your y-axis, you have how well they live their life. If they're in full health or if they are experiencing some sort of health problem, that leads to a decline in their quality of life. When it comes to QALYs, we have our utility weight on our y-axis. And you can imagine this sort of health profile that you can see on the purple, in the purple outline, where someone experiences certain different events at which leads to declines in their health, and eventually they die. So the sense that this person had a life expectancy of just under 8 years. And the quality adjusted life years is that period, that whole space underneath that health profile, underneath the line. So it's a composite measure that takes into account both longevity and quality of life. Similarly, DALYs take into account both longevity and quality of life, but in sort of an opposite way. So DALYs are measuring ill health or loss of health. So as you can see here, DALYs are years of life that are lived with a disability, so in less than perfect health, and the years of life lost compared to some ideal life expectancy in a population. As you can see here on the y-axis, we have, rather than the utility weight, we have our disability weight. And it's the opposite of our utility weight, in that 0 represents, a disability weight of 0 represents perfect health, no loss of health, whereas a disability weight of 1 represents full loss of all health or death. So you might be saying these two things are similar to each other, but how can we use them interchangeably? Generally, when we're using QALYs or DALYs for a cost utility analysis, we're looking at the impact of an intervention. So we're looking to say, what is the health profile without the intervention compared to the health profile with the intervention? And we want to compare the differences in QALYs or DALYs. When you roll out a vaccine, or when you roll out a drug or make a drug available to a population. And so you might imagine, you might see a different health profile of improved health with an intervention. And that shaded area that you can see in the graph is what we're interested in measuring, our quality adjusted life years gained as a result of a treatment or a policy or an intervention. And quite similarly, if we're talking about in the DALY space, we can think about DALYs averted rather than QALYs gained. And again, it's that shaded area. So it's looking at the impact of an intervention, the DALYs averted without the intervention, the DALYs that are accrued without the intervention, the DALYs accrued with an intervention. The difference would be the DALYs averted as a result of the intervention. So you can see why we sort of think of them as similar to each other. We can talk about QALYs gained or DALYs averted. In terms of utility weights and disability weights, similarly, they are quite similar to each other in opposite sets. So we think about them as sort of one minus the other. So utility weights generally range between 0, representing death, and 1, representing perfect health. Similarly, disability rates range between 0 and 1, but where 0 represents perfect health and 1 represents death. So just to give you an example, a value of 0.8 for a utility weight would represent that a year lived in that state of 0.8 is equivalent to 0.8 of a year lived in perfect health. If we're thinking about disability weights, the value of 0.2, for example, indicates that living for a year in a disability weight state that's valued at 0.2 is equivalent to losing 0.2 of a year in perfect health, or living for 0.8 of a year in perfect health. In the case of utility weights, we can have states that are worse than death, so have a utility weight of less than 0, whereas that's not possible in the disability weight space. And then both have very similar properties in terms of equal interval properties, which allow us to essentially multiply them by longevity, by length of life, to calculate our DALYs and our QALYs. So given this, this sort of thinking that utility weights and disability weights are sort of interchangeable, one minus the other, a recent study was looked at particular health states that were defined by the Global Burden of Disease study, and used an EQ5D, which I'll talk about a little bit later for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a multi-attribute utility instrument that gives us utility weights for different health states. And so they conducted a mapping study looking at specific health states and came up with utility weights using EQ5D and compared them to the GBD disability weights. And they found quite significant differences between the utility weights and the disability weights that were generated through the study and the GBD disability weights, and even found differences not just in the actual values of the weights, but also the rankings of different health states when looking at the EQ5D utility weights and disability weights. So why is this even important? We all tend to just use the disability weights or utility weights that are available to us when conducting a cost effectiveness analysis. So I think the motivation for why you might want to care about the differences that exist between these two weights comes out of this recent review that was based on the Tufts New England Registry, cost effectiveness registry. That's essentially a database that's trying to populate every single cost effectiveness or cost utility study that exists that's been conducted in the world. They recently included cost per DALY studies. They were previously only including cost per QALY studies. And they've conducted a review of all published studies that were done and noticed quite important differences across countries in use of dollar per DALY or dollar per QALY. That was based on geography and based on income, which I think is quite self-evident for those of you who are familiar with the distinctions between the two. But I think what's also interesting is that they noticed quite important differences in the use of dollars per DALY or dollars per QALY studies across intervention, across prevention stage, and across disease category. So I'll elaborate on that in the next two slides. Here you can see the geographical differences in use of dollars per QALY or dollars per DALY studies. So on your left-hand side, those are, you probably can't read the legend very well from where you're sitting, but those are dollars per QALY studies. And the reddish, as you go darker to the orange and red, indicates more of those studies are being done in those countries. So you can see more North American countries, areas, and countries in Europe. Australia are doing a little bit more in dollars per QALY compared to the rest of the world. On your right-hand side of the figure, so part B, these are dollars per DALY studies. So you can see those are used a lot more often in low and middle income country settings. So you can see India and some parts of sub-Saharan Africa here. What I thought was quite interesting is that they're also used quite a bit in Australia, which is where I'm based at the moment, and I wasn't aware of that. So I want to look into seeing who's actually doing dollars per DALY studies based out of Australia, because high-income countries tend to use dollars per QALY studies. So there's geographical differences and differences across income, but also interestingly, if you look at the differences in the two types of studies, first you can see that a lot more dollars per QALY studies are conducted than dollars per DALY studies. That's the N at the top of each of these, at the top of the tables here. But if you look at interventions, cost per QALY studies tend to focus on pharmaceutical interventions predominantly. Cost per DALY studies are sort of evenly spread out across pharmaceutical interventions, health, education, or behavioral style interventions, and immunization was a big category that popped up. And then if you look also at the prevention stage, you can see that cost per DALY studies focus a lot more on primary or secondary prevention versus cost per QALY studies that focus a lot more on tertiary prevention. And then disease categories also vary quite a bit between the two types of studies. So my main message to you regarding this study is that these two types of measures for cost utility studies are used quite differently across the world and across disease areas. And so any systematic differences between DALYs and QALYs that are used differently across different disease areas potentially may lead to different decisions being made if the choice is made to use a cost per DALY or cost per QALY. So I want to look a little bit more into what the distinctions are between DALYs and QALYs and whether that might lead to any policy implications. this choice between DALY or QALY really seems to be quite historic, and it seems to be based on the use of disability weights that came about through the WHO for the global burden of disease study. So these were developed essentially to measure and quantify ill health in a consistent way around the world for all countries of the world. And so the focus really of DALY based studies really is in low and middle income countries settings primarily. But I think it's important to note that the goal of the DALYs and disability weights was really to measure loss of health, ill health, as opposed to welfare loss or quality of life, which we're typically thinking about when we think about utility weights. And this was really stressed even more in the most recent iteration of the Global Burden of Disease studies, where there was a concrete focus to narrow down the framing effect of what they were looking for in the latest disability weight studies, where they're really narrowing it down from overall welfare loss or quality of life loss to health, a really narrow focus on health versus health-related quality of life. So we can think about the differences between utility weights and disability weights in three main aspects, and I'll touch on each of these aspects during the rest of this talk. We can think about the how to elicit these weights and how they might vary across the two types of measures. We can think about the from whom do we elicit these weights from, and I'll touch on that just very briefly. And then we can think about the what. What are we actually asking about? In terms of utility weights, we're often thinking about health-related quality of life. In terms of disability weights, we're often thinking about loss of health as a more narrow construct. And I'll touch on that in the last half of this talk. So I want to move next into the how we elicit these weights. And I'll talk a little bit about the current methods and approaches that are used for eliciting health state valuations. Here's a bit of an overview on the methods that are generally used in this field. We think about two main classes of approaches that are used. There's direct elicitation approaches, and then multi-attribute or pre-scored instrument approaches. And I'll touch on each of these different types. There's also slightly newish approaches based on discrete choice experiments that are being used as well. And all of those sort of feed into the construct of utility weights and disability weights. So here's an example of a direct elicitation approach. You've probably seen this before. You probably filled it out before if you filled out an EP5Z on the back of it. This is called a visual analog scale or score. It's also called the thermometer scale. And if you haven't seen it before, as you can see, it's a very simple approach. You're really just given a scale that looks a little bit like a thermometer, ranging usually from 0 to 100, where 100 represents your best imaginable health state and 0 represents your worst imaginable health state, and you're asked to decide where your health state today fits along that scale. You can imagine it's a very simple, very quick way to elicit evaluation for someone's health state, but there's a lot of negative aspects about this particular instrument. So there's documented proof that people sort of stay away from the top and the bottom of the scale. It's quite lumpy, the measurements that come out of the scale, so people wouldn't necessarily place their health at an 83.5 on the scale. You generally sort of put yourself around an 80 or an 85 or a 90, or wherever you might be. So you sort of stick to the big graduations in the scale. And there's no real trade-off that you're making here, so it doesn't follow the axioms of expected utility theory. It's not a preferred approach. So another approach that's used quite often in direct elicitation is called the time trade-off. And so essentially what you're doing here is you're offering people two different choices, two alternatives. The first alternative, as you can see in this figure, is living for 10 years in a certain health state that's less than perfect health. Alternative 2 is being restored to full health. So you can imagine that you're given a pill, this magic pill that you just have to take, there's no side effects, and you're brought up to perfect health. But there is a little bit of a downside in that rather than living 10 years of life, it shortens your life expectancy. And so now you're only able to live 8 years of life or 7 years of life. And so that X, you'd vary to the point where you're indifferent between your two alternatives, and that's at that point you would find your utility value for your health state. So you can imagine, for example, being given the following health states, being told to imagine you're in this health state, and then being given a series of choices for that value X, at which point you find the state where you're indifferent between the two alternatives. So this method, as you can see, compared to the last method, is a little bit more complex. It takes a little bit more time to think about it and to understand the alternatives that you're given. There are also some people who essentially would refuse to trade off any time for being brought up to a perfect health state. And there's people find it sort of cognitively a little bit challenging sometimes to answer some of these questions. Another direct elicitation approach is called standard gamble, which is a little bit similar, but here what we're doing is we're giving you a choice between a certain health state, so you can imagine that same health state that I gave you the example of in the last slide, or this lottery, a gamble between perfect health or death. And there's a certain probability of achieving perfect health, and 1 minus that probability of actually dying. And so you vary the P, your probability of being in perfect health here, until you find the point where you're indifferent between remaining in that health state with certainty or choosing the lottery where you have a chance of being restored to perfect health, but you could end up dying. People argue that the standard gamble sort of reflects real-life medical decisions that are being made. For example, if you have to undergo a surgery, there may be a probability of death that is associated with that surgery to restore your back pain or to improve your back pain, for instance. And so people do make these choices. But the downside to this approach as well is that people don't tend to understand, most people don't tend to understand probability very well in daily life. And so it is quite cognitively challenging to make sure people understand this approach and understand what you're really trying to get at. This population health equivalence is the approach that has been used for the global burden of disease study to elicit disability weights. And in this case, you're being told to imagine that you're in government or you're a decision maker, and you have a limited budget where you can either choose to fund program A or program B. Program A would avert 1,000 deaths, for example. Program B, on the other hand, wouldn't avert any deaths, but it would prevent a certain number of health conditions. So, for example, deafness. It might prevent 2,000 cases of deafness, or 5,000, or 10,000. And so that number is varied until you find that you're at the point where you're indifferent between funding program A or funding program B. And so this approach has been argued that it's quite similar to what policymakers have to make, decisions that they have to make in real life, and so really reflects real-world decision-making. And this is it's also called person trade-off. This is what was used for eliciting related disability weights in the global burden of disease study. So apart from the direct elicitation approaches, there are what are now known as multi-attribute utility instruments or pre-scored instruments that exist. And these instruments are a lot easier to use for patients at different cognitive levels, at different educational levels, at different settings. A variety of different examples exist, and so I've listed a few of the most commonly used examples down at the bottom of the slide: the EQ5D, the QALY 2 and 3, the QALY that was developed in Australia and used in Australia quite a bit. And they all vary, but they're all fairly similar in terms of what they're doing. They generally provide a certain number of attributes, for example, or domains, 5 to 7 attributes. And then there are different questions that exist within each of those attributes. So those attributes could be related to mental health, they could be related to pain, they could be related to mobility, getting yourself around, or your daily activities. And you're asked questions about how you're doing within each of those different attributes. And the choice of researchers using different types of instruments really depends on the population group, the disease or the health state that's being looked at, and the intervention that's being looked at. And that really depends on the attributes that are being captured by the instruments, and then the levels that exist within each of those attributes. So for example, the EQ5D initially, it had 5 questions, and initially it was only 3 levels, which, as you can imagine, is a little bit crude if you want to try to capture small differences in a health state. Now there's a 5-level version that exists, but it still might not be that great for some types of diseases. So for example, it only has 1 mental health question, whereas the QALY has several mental health questions. So how do you go from filling out a simple questionnaire that has 5 or 10 or 30 questions about your health today to actually getting a utility score? There is a scoring algorithm or formula that's generally applied to the responses to come up with a utility value. And these scoring formulas come from one of the direct elicitation approaches that I mentioned previously that was conducted in the general population. So for the EQ5D, for example, there's a formula that's based on preferences in the UK. And they have other, if you're in other countries, they have other formulas that are applied based on preferences in the general population across different country settings. For the global burden of disease study, the most recent version used what are known as discrete choice experiments. And so these are becoming a lot more popular in the field of health utility and disability weight measurements. And this is an example of the questions that was used in the GBD study. This was a paired comparison question, which essentially asked people to compare 2 different health states that were described using very brief descriptions. And respondents were asked to choose which person they thought was healthier overall. Again, while this gives you a ranking for different health states, and it can give you an amount at which health states differ in terms of their valuation, it doesn't actually give you a valuation on a 0 to 1 utility or disability weight scale. So you still need to come back and use the direct elicitation approach to anchor your final estimates into a 0 to 1 disability weight or utility weight scale. So in the case of this global burden disease study for eliciting disability weight, the results of the paired comparison questions were anchored back onto the 0 to 1 disability weight scale using a paired population health equivalent question. So they could have used a different type of direct elicitation method, but they needed to use one of those to anchor it back into the 0 to 1 disability weight scale. DCs are also being used in the utility weight space. And this is just an example from a fairly recent paper that looked at a discrete choice experiment with time trade-off embedded within it. So rather than just describing 2 different health states, they included a longevity aspect within the question as well. So as you can see, there's 2 life that are being compared here, life A and life B. There's different descriptions in terms of different attributes. And the last piece of the description includes the duration of life. So they're comparing here, live 4 years versus live for 10 years. And so your time trade-off is actually embedded within your discrete choice experiment, which allows you to get around the anchoring issue because you have your direct elicitation method already embedded within your paired comparisons or your discrete choice experiments. It's important to note that the reason people are shifting to discrete choice experiments is because they are thought to be cognitively easier to do, easier to make a choice that looks like a paired comparisons question versus what people thought of the cognitive burdens that relied on time trade-off or standard gamble. But it's important to realize that the time trade-off is sort of already embedded within these questions. And so the thought that perhaps these are cognitively less challenging than a time trade-off may not necessarily be true. Here what you can see is the differences in health state valuations, utility weights, for the DCE time trade-off compared to the standalone simple time trade-off questions. And as you can see for health states, for low severity health states, both methods sort of do quite similar to each other. As you get to more severe health states, they vary quite a bit, the valuations for each health state. So there's no gold standard in eliciting utility weights or disability weights. So we can't say which method might necessarily be preferred to the other, but we can observe that there are differences between the 2 methods. quite substantial differences as well as you get to more severe states. So that's an overview of some of the methods that have been used for valuing health states and coming up with utility weights and visibility weights that are then used in calculating QALYs and DALYs for cost utility analyses. I'm going to just briefly touch on the from whom question before going into the last piece, which is going to be the second half of this talk. Generally, there's a lot of rich debate, and there's been ongoing debate about from whom we should elicit these preferences. Is it patients? Is it caregivers or medical providers who sort of know about lots of different health conditions and can more reliably compare them? Or is it the general public? And I think overall the consensus has led towards the general public being used to provide national estimates for utility weights. So those algorithms that I mentioned, the pre-scored instruments, the multi-attribute utility instruments, generally rely on estimates from the general population or preferences from a general population. In the case of disability weights, the early disability weight studies used medical professionals to essentially come up with disability weights that they thought were appropriate for different health conditions. And more recently, they've also moved towards the use of general population, lay population estimates for eliciting these weights. I think one important distinction is in the case of utility weights, we often rely on national level population estimates. So if I'm doing a study in Australia and using the EQ5D, I would tend to want to use the Australian societal weights, which differ from the UK weights or other countries in Europe, the weights in other countries. Whereas on the other, for the disability weight study, the estimates were really pooled across a number of different countries around the world to come up with global estimates for disability weights that are consistent across the world. And does that really matter? Well, there are quite substantial differences, as you can see, across societies, across countries. This is looking at the EQ5D valuations for a small number of countries: Australia, the UK, Japan, and Spain. For all the different 243 health states that exist within the 5-question EQ5D questionnaire. And as you can see, there's quite substantial differences that exist if you use one scoring algorithm for one country versus another. So there are societal and cultural differences that exist. What's quite interesting to note is that the latest GBD disability weight study actually found very minimal differences that existed across countries when coming with disability weights. And remember, this is a more narrow construct of health loss versus the broader construct of welfare loss that are being measured through utility weights. So finally, I want to go into this last point about what are we actually asking about, and focus really on this difference between health-related quality of life and the narrow construct of health loss. And that's the focus of some of the ongoing work that I'm doing at the moment that I'd like to share some of the results with you on. So that brings us into part 2, looking at trying to distinguish between health versus health-related quality of life using preference-based survey responses. So I just want to acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Professor Josh Solomon and Professor David Studdard. Both are at Stanford now. Josh was previously my supervisor at Harvard, and David was my prior supervisor when I moved over to Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. So, as I said, our main study aim was to investigate differences between health state ratings, looking at both the rankings of health states, but also actually placing a value on these health states when we ask about health versus when we ask about quality of life. So we conducted a blood-based survey of the general public in Australia. We had just over 5,000 people respond to our survey. And we followed the global burden of disease methods quite closely. So we asked participants a series of pairwise comparisons in which 2 different hypothetical health states were described, and asked people to choose which health state they preferred, essentially. We randomly assigned people to a version that asked about health and to a version that asked about quality of life. So there's no overlap between the questions that were being asked. People were just only asked about health or only asked about quality of life. And so this is sort of what our paired comparisons questions look like. They look very familiar to you because they follow the global burden of disease methods very closely. Consider the following two people. The first person has X and the health state is described. The second person has Y. And those descriptions were randomly assigned. So there's an equal probability of any of the different health states being selected. And for the quality of life versions, we asked, who do you think has a better overall quality of life, the first person or the second person? For the health questions, we pretty much asked the same question, but we just focused on health. So we asked, who do you think is healthier overall, the first person or the second person? Our health states were selected from the 220 health states that were included in the 2010 Global Burden of Disease study. We also included one additional health state that was included in the ongoing at the time, but now completed European disability weight study. Because the study was embedded into a larger program of work that we were doing, we focused primarily on injuries and disorders that were commonly occurred in workplace and transport-related accident injuries. So, for example, we had pain and disability following injuries. We had mental health conditions. We had sensory disorders, so hearing loss and vision loss, amputations, disfigurements. So anything that you might consider back pain, things that you might consider occurring during a workplace accident or a transport-related accident. All of our health states that we considered were long-term. They were permanent health states. And they covered a whole range of severity. So all the way, our most minimal health state was lower back pain, mild back pain. Our most severe health state was paraplegia. We had quadriplegia considered as well. We also had traumatic brain injury health states that we considered as well. So we included 48 health states in this particular study. You can see them here. They're lumped into a small number of categories. So we had musculoskeletal problems. So this included pain or not being able to sort of use your arms or legs properly. We had other pain and physical limitations that resulted from an injury. So this includes amputations or spinal cord lesions and traumatic brain injuries. As I mentioned previously, we had a small number of mental health disorders. As you can see, we have different states within anxiety disorders, for example. So we have mild, moderate, and severe for a lot of these different conditions. We had sensory disorders, as I said before, and then we had one other category, which was mainly disfigurement. So 3 different types of disfigurement. The descriptions of the health states were taken primarily from the Global Burden of Disease studies, which were essentially very short descriptions that tried to capture the most salient aspects of the health condition. They involved experts from around the world that came together to try and write out these descriptions in a consistent manner across all different conditions. They were very short. They're in layperson's terms. You don't have to be a medical professional to understand what the description was of this health state. They didn't involve the name of the actual health state, so they were just a description of the impact of the condition. And for a few of our health states, for 9 out of the 48, we actually used terminology from the European Disability Weight Study rather than the Global Burden of Disease Study, because they captured slightly more information than the Global Burden of Disease descriptions included. And this was more for the spinal cord health states and a few additional health states where there's a little bit more description. It's still a very short health state description, but there just was a little bit more important descriptions available. In terms of our statistical analysis, we used very standard methods for analyzing paired comparison questions, relying on probit regression analysis. And essentially what the underlying theory behind this type of analysis is that the difference in regression coefficients between our health states is linearly related to the difference in mean underlying quality of life or health, if we're asking the health question. So you can imagine probability densities that look a little bit like this for health state A or health state B. If these health states are very different in severity, you're asking about a small pain in your toe or a small itch on your arm versus being confined to a wheelchair for the rest of your life, you can imagine those probability distributions are quite spread out. And most people, nearly 100% of people who answer those paired comparison questions we'll say this health state is better than that health state. If they're sort of more similar in severity, you can imagine that those probability densities will have a little bit of overlap. And so that degree of overlap is what determines how spread out, how far apart your utility weights are. We still have to rescale, as I mentioned before in the background, talking about how these valuations are elicited. We still have to rescale our coefficients onto a 0 to 1 visibility weight scale. And so we did this by anchoring to known visibility weights to known health states using this global burden disease visibility weight. Our rescaling was in logit transform space, similarly to the global burden disease methodology. And just to give you a sense of the participants of our survey, so as I mentioned, we had just over 5,000 respondents. The survey was carried out towards the end of 2013. Because we were doing a few other things as part of this work, we had more people filling out the quality of life surveys versus the health surveys. So we had just over 4,000 people that completed the quality of life version versus 1,000 people completing the health version, but we still had a lot of data for both questions that we are looking at in terms of numbers of paired comparison questions. And we had very similar demographic characteristics across the different survey versions and similar characteristics of our survey population to the background population. And so you can see here, we had a similar distribution across state or territory, in quite similar distribution across age group, although we had fewer lower people at populations at lower ages than the general population and populations at higher ages than the general population. Similar distribution in terms of gender, although we had more people that were born in Australia complete our survey than in the background population. We had more people that were of higher education in our survey as well. As you can imagine, they'd have to be, this is an online survey, so they'd have to know how to use the internet, have access to a computer at home. And we had more people reporting lower incomes than people in the general population. So it's just unclear whether this reflects real income and they're available to carry out the survey, or whether this reflects people reporting slightly lower incomes than they actually have. So a little bit unclear about that. But in general, our survey respondents matched quite closely to the background population and to each other. We did a few checks to look at the quality of our data. So we first looked at the logical consistency of health state ranking. So if you recall, we had several health states. We had 7 groups. We had a large number of health states in which there were either 2 levels within those health states, 3 levels, or 4 levels that reflected increasing severity within that health state. So of those 14 health state groups, all health states ranked as expected. So we never had a more severe health state that actually ranked less severely than a mild or a moderate health state. So that was the first check. We looked at the consistency of responses. So for about 20% of respondents in one version of our survey, they were presented twice with the same pairwise comparison question. So question 1, we repeated at question 15. And so we compared how consistent they were with the responses. And we found quite a high degree of consistency in responses, an agreement of 80% with a kappa score of nearly 0.6, which indicates moderately good agreement after adjusting for chance. Our agreement increased quite a bit once we removed health states that were very close in severity, which I haven't shown here. And you can imagine that health states that are very close in severity, you might go either way if you're presented with that question one time or twice. And finally, we looked at a heat map of our survey responses, just to look at the level of measurement error visually in our survey responses. So here you see this is a heat map of our response probabilities. If everyone in the survey just responded at random to our questions, you would expect this graph to just be a complete mix of blues, greens, and reds in the survey. But what we see here is more of an ordered transition across probabilities. And essentially, just to help you interpret this, what we're comparing is the first health state in a pair on the x-axis, which is ranked from best to worst health state, and the second health state on the y-axis, again ranged from best to worst, and the probability of choosing that first health state. So if you're comparing a very good first health state with a very bad health state, that's what you find at the top left-hand corner, you would expect nearly 100% of people to say that first health state is much better. So you can see a lot of blue in that in that top left-hand corner, transitioning to green, where you're sort of equivalent between the two because you're presented with health states that are quite similar in severity, transitioning all the way down to red, where you're more likely to select the second health state because you're comparing a worse health state with a better health state. So this just gives you an idea of the visual of the amount of measurement error in our survey. So on to some results. I know you cannot read any of the words on this figure. This is just to illustrate that we first looked at rankings of health states across for quality of life questions and for the health construct. And so a lot of health states sort of ranked quite similarly, but as you can see, some health states did shift quite a bit in terms of their ranking if you asked about health versus asking about quality of life. So this doesn't tell you too much. So what I've done next is to remove all health states except those in which the rankings varied by plus or minus 3 spots in rank order. So we've removed a lot of health states, and I want to point out a few of the more interesting changes in ranking when asking about health versus quality of life here. So first, our sensory disorders popped up, where if you're asking about quality of life, these conditions were rated as more severely than if you're asking about health. And I think that sort of makes sense intuitively if you think about asking about the impact of having a severe vision disorder, being blind, for instance, or not being able to hear at all, on the impact on your quality of life versus how you would consider that as just a health loss. So if you're asking about quality of life, these conditions are sort of rated a little bit more severely than health. Injuries and musculoskeletal disorders, for the most part, worked in the opposite direction. So they ranked worse on health versus quality of life. The impact of that health condition on your quality of life was less severe, except for spinal cord lesions, in which the impact of that health condition, being paralyzed from the waist down or from the neck down, was worse when you thought about the quality of life of that condition compared to the health effects, just health alone, the loss of health of that condition. And then disfigurement showed up as well, where, again, I think intuitively, the impact, the quality of life impact of a disfigurement condition was worse when you asked about quality of life versus when you asked about health alone. Interestingly, this is only moderate disfigurement that showed up. Severe disfigurement didn't show up. They were actually ranked exactly the same for the health construct versus the quality of life construct. And what I think was most interesting for me, what I was expecting to pop up, was the mental health conditions. And none of them popped up as changing rankings when you looked at health versus quality of life. And I was expecting more of the mental health conditions to pop up, or some mental health conditions to pop up as worse when you think about the quality of life impact of being depressed or having anxiety disorders compared to the health impact. And I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that. But potentially that we've been really great as a society in terms of normalizing mental health conditions and considering them more of a health problem rather than just something that's sort of apart from physical health disorders. But something I'm going to explore a little bit more. But moving beyond just rankings, we also looked at the health state valuations if you compare the two constructs. And so we correlated our final disability weights with our GVD disability weights and found high correlations, as you'd expect, because they were anchored on our GVD disability weights. We found no real difference overall in disability weights when asking about health versus quality of life. So there was a very small mean difference between the two, but the estimated disability weights did vary by over 0.05 for a number of conditions. For 9 out of 48 health conditions, there was a difference of greater than 0.05 in disability weights. Here you can see that those differences in disability weights when asking about health versus quality of life for all 48 health states. The values that score higher than the 0 here is where health is considered worse than quality of life, and the ones that go below 0 are where quality of life is considered worse than health. And you can see here that hearing, that sensory disorders pop up again, hearing loss specifically. Spinal cord lesions, as we talked about before, where there was quite a big difference in ranking. Disfigurement as well, which I pointed out before in the rankings. What's interesting here is that severe disfigurement shows up in terms of when you actually put a value on that health state, whereas there's no difference in ranking. And then similarly, some of the musculoskeletal and pain disorders pop up on the other side, where health is considered worse quality of life. And then what's interesting is that one of the mental health conditions pop up here that didn't show up when you looked at just rankings, but when you actually place the value on the health state, one of the mental health conditions popped up as having a difference, but it's a difference in the way that opposite to the way that I was expecting. So in this case, for major depressive disorder, severe major depression, when asking about health, this condition ranked worse than when asking about quality of life. So a little bit of a counterintuitive result, I would think. But nonetheless, some important, quite substantial differences in valuations between health states when asking about the exact same health states when asking about health versus quality of life. So there are a lot of limitations to this type of work, namely, primarily that is a web-based survey, and there's a lot of documentations about web-based surveys not necessarily being able to pick up very good health state valuations, but in-person questionnaires in which you could help people to understand the survey questions a little bit more. There's issues around the generalizability of these findings from Australia to other settings, perhaps, and this may also, the findings may be context-specific, more relating to quality of life than to health, potentially, based on what's been noted around utility weights varying across contexts versus disability weights remaining fairly consistent across settings. There's quite a big issue that I think exists around the completeness of the health state descriptions, and this was noted in the most recent European disability weight study, where they actually they tested several different types of descriptions of health states and found differences when they used different descriptions for that same health state. There's issues particularly for our states around adaptation effects, because we include a lot of injury-related health states in this particular study. And then I think our final valuations for health states may really depend on the number of health states that we've included in our survey, and also the anchoring to what we're anchoring our valuations to get back into the 0 to 1 disability weight scale. So just to end with a few policy implications of this work. We did find in general that the differences in our rankings of health states did correspond to differences in valuations for our health states, although that wasn't always the case. So there was one case for mental health conditions where there was no difference in ranking in the health states, but we did find quite substantial differences in the valuation for the health state. Asking about quality of life versus health resulted in few differences, about 8 out of 48 health states, of over 0.05 in disability weight, a change of 0.05. I think the policy implications here are, is that a big enough difference to result in different cost-effectiveness, incremental cost-effectiveness ratios, and potentially differences in decisions that might be made if you choose to ask about a narrow construct of health versus a broader construct of quality of life, which really gets at the differences between the use of utilities versus disability weights in different studies. Is that a big enough difference? It's not a huge difference, but we know that our incremental cost-effectiveness ratio is a ratio, and we know that small changes in our numerator or our denominator especially can lead to very different final incremental ratios. However, that being said, I do want to stress that the differences found here are probably a lot smaller than differences that would exist if you use different methodological choices that I mentioned, direct elicitation approaches for listing health state valuations, so differences between time trade-off and standard gamble, for example, different types of survey of multi-attribute utility instruments if you're using the EQ5D versus the QALYs, for example. And so those differences are likely to be a lot larger than the differences that we've seen in here where we focus specifically on the construct of health versus quality of life. There's a few further directions that I want to take this work. These are just preliminary results. I want to look a lot into anchor states, choice of anchor states, number of anchor states as well, in terms of getting these results back into the 0-1 scale, and then consider how these results might change if a different set of health states were being considered apart from injuries and sensory disorders. So I think there's a few different avenues for work ongoing from this. But that's all I have for now. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions. Are there any questions or comments? Yeah.
Quality of life. Life's a very complex issue to live through, and you're entirely focused on health-related quality of life, HPAR, QALY, right? And in this attempt to define meaningful differences between perception of health and perception of quality of life, how can you get there? I mean, as you know, in measuring quality of life, the disease-specific instruments, as we call them, are very useful measuring outcomes and so on. And then you've got all the generic ones like EQ5D, which I think is great, by the way, and likely to become the world standard. And your Australian one, and HUI, and SF12, and SF36, and all the rest of it. So that's a step away from the disease specificity into a more generic thing. But what about all the other stuff? What about your wife's left you and you've got 2 kids in jail and you just lost your job and you're going to lose your house?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you, the kind of detail you get, how can you go that far without getting into so many other things that affect what I'll call, for want of a better term, the happiness index?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of work around trying to move in that direction to capture things beyond just the health-related, your quality of life that's specific to that health condition, but moving a bit more broadly. So I think there's a few people looking at developing a capability index that goes a little bit further and takes into account what the impact of that health condition is on your capability to work, to earn an income, and other aspects, to have relationships, other aspects of your life. They haven't, as far as I know, they haven't sort of progressed as far as being accepted in the health technology assessment space, and I think that's going to take quite a while to get to that place where you know, people already think about QALYs and DALYs as, in a way, black boxes where we're not entirely sure what goes into them, or people that don't understand them very well. And so now trying to add additional things that are very important and very relevant makes it a little bit more tricky, I think, to sort of justify. But there is a lot of methods, there's a lot of work, I think, going on around developing that. But you're absolutely right. That's not, I haven't touched on that at all. And it's a very important area that needs to be defined a little bit better. Would you like to comment on that, Lynn?
Well, yeah, just a follow-up. I was thinking along the same lines as you were talking, because, you know, when you were comparing health and quality of life, really the content of what you were describing in terms of descriptors were not really very different. And I think of quality of life as Charles was suggesting, including things like marital relationships, spirituality, whether you live in a fancy part of town or not, what your social relationships are. And, you know, it has a lot of things that extend beyond this. And you were comparing 2 descriptors, like the same descriptor of health, with essentially a different label. And I'm wondering if what you're getting at is really not more of a framing effect, rather than substantive differences in what you're actually measuring. Because, you know, it was the same substantive content. It was a description of health, just framed slightly differently.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So you could approach this in different ways and actually sort of list out the quality of life impacts, ask people to consider those in your question. But a lot of times, for example, in the disability weight study or in other settings where you're asking discrete choice experiments, you're not sort of laying all of that out. You're describing the attributes, and you're sort of expecting people to respond based on how they interpret that attribute affecting their relationships and their sleep.
But you know, if you wanted to get at that, you might then ask, okay, here's the stuff that we're leaving out of health-related quality of life. Think about spirituality. Think about your relationships. How do you think this might affect all of those other things? And now let's consider that comparison.
Yeah,
Then you might get at a fairer comparison about the global as opposed to more constrained.
Yeah, no, you're right. So I should have mentioned, I should have put we had a little blurb prior to people actually getting into each question that did ask people to prompt. We didn't ask about spirituality, but we did prompt about think about how this condition might affect on your relationships, activities, daily living, ability to sort of go about your general life. So they were a little bit more constrained. They weren't as broad, but we did prompt people to think about those prior to starting the survey. And we also prompted people to not think about financial implications. So we were trying to get away from the financial implications of the health state. So we specified, think about X, Y, Z in terms of relationships and all the other things that could be affected by your, in terms of your quality of life and your well-being. And we specified to not think about the medical costs of the disease or the health condition or the earnings loss. So we tried to disentangle that. But I think you're right. That's one way to frame it. And you're right, it is a framing effect, I think, that we're looking at. I wasn't expecting to see much difference at all, and I was quite surprised to see some interesting differences pop up for a very narrow construct, a very narrow difference. You could explore this in a lot more of a different term in terms of including a broader description of what you'd like people to think about.
Yeah, the other comment I'll make, and I'll be quiet, is that for both DALYs and QALYs, the usual use at a policy level is to allocate health budgets. It's not really for the purposes of making intersectoral allocation decisions. And so generally we don't use these cost-benefit analyses. We don't use them to argue that we need more or less money for health relative to defense, relative to social spending. I mean, they're really measures of health. They're not measures of global well-being in both cases. So I'm not really sure that there's a whole lot of upside in kind of pursuing this additional measure of global, unless you move to something like a cost-benefit analysis where you really do want kind of a global measure of well-being. You know, that's, I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree with that. So I don't think it's sort of moving too close to the cost-benefit analysis space, but I think in general, when we're thinking about utility waste, we are thinking about quality of health-related quality of life. So we are broadening it beyond just the health specific domain. We would talk in the space of health-related quality of life in the utility space, which doesn't go beyond sort of education, it doesn't sort of branch into the impacts on your educational attainment or your earnings income, although it really depends on what people take into account when they answer these surveys. And we don't really know, we don't tend to ask people, what were you thinking about when you answered that particular survey? Were you thinking about X, Y, Z that goes beyond the health sector? But I think you're right. There's a lot of uncertainty or not that much clarity around what we're actually trying to get at when we're looking at measuring our utility waste in this space. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, to your point about not being able to control what people think about when they answer a survey or the fair choice experiment, you've demonstrated here that you can change the label of whatever construct that you're measuring, and it seems to have relatively profound influences on how people answer decisions. Does that to you shed any doubt or concern about the validity of answers depending on how you label, let's say, the attributes or the levels? Or you could have said severe, you could have said profound, you could have said total or complete, and these words may have different implications for different people that are very hard to measure. And so in the whole space of valuation, the words we use seem to matter a lot. Can you comment on that?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So actually, the descriptions that you saw with the severe, moderate, those weren't given to people at all. So they never saw those descriptions. they saw an actual wordy description of the health state that didn't include words like severe. So they would talk about complete hearing loss versus slight hearing loss, where with an example given where you can hear the telephone ringing, but
even, for example, if you use a different example for one person, it might be more influential for that person,
completely.
and a different example in another situation. So it's very hard to control.
Yeah, and the descriptions given were quite short in length, and it's often very difficult to capture the full effects of the health condition in a very small description. So a very interesting paper that came out was the European Disability Weight Study. I think it was by Hagsma et al. And they looked at the same health state but described in slightly different ways. So they used the GBD disability weight, the GBD description, and then a description that they came up with that was similar to but slightly more detailed than the GBD study, and found very big differences for the exact same health state that was described differently. So I think that those descriptions are very important and probably likely to result in bigger differences in valuations than these differences of framing effects between health and quality of life. And I think there's more work to be done in that space in terms of how we're actually defining these states. That's a great point. Yeah, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just going based off of what he has said, dissimilar populations probably evaluate different conditions differently. Did you notice any major difference between subsets of your population and the utility values that they assign to the different conditions?
Yeah, we didn't go that far. We've done sort of basic correlations and responses across different segments of the population by educational attainment and income and gender. We didn't find any differences there. But we haven't gone as far as to sort of what I'm more interested in is looking at different educational levels, specifically higher education levels, and then going forward and coming up with those valuations. I haven't done that piece yet.
A physician would assign a different utility value than a member of, the general public.
Possibly. And we did ask a question about whether the person had any medical background or was working in a medical setting, and I haven't looked at that one yet as well to see if there's any differences between the two.
I think we are over time now.
Yeah, sorry.
So let's thank Natalie for a very, very interesting talk. Next time, let's wait to get approached.